We live in the most agriculturally productive moment in human history. At least in theory, the global food system is more than capable of supporting the billions of people who currently live on the planet. But how did we arrive at this time? In this video, we're going to explore the global history of farming. And that history begins more than 12,000 years ago, as human communities gradually transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled communities centered around farming. As human communities gradually transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled communities centered around farming in the Neolithic or agricultural revolution. That process began independently in multiple regions around the world, first in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE, then in the Yangtze and Yellow River basins in modern China around 9,000 years ago, and in the highlands of Papua New Guinea shortly after that. Farming originated in central Mexico, the northern portions of South America, and in sub-Saharan Africa sometime around 5,000 years ago, and in eastern North America around 4,000 years ago. From these regions, farming spread around the world, eventually reaching nearly every corner of the globe. By selecting wild varieties of plants and animals for breeding for selective traits, early farmers in Mesoamerica were able to transform the wild grass teosinte with its small, hard kernels into modern maize, selecting varieties with desirable traits like larger kernels, easier harvesting, and higher yields, and developing varieties with longer, more nutritious kernels. Neolithic farmers in the Fertile Crescent selected and bred varieties of wild grasses with more robust spikes and non-shattering heads, crossbreeding varieties into wheat and barley. In the Yangtze River Valley of modern China, farmers started to cultivate wild rice varieties, selecting for traits including larger grains, higher yields, and non-shattering heads that prevented grain loss during harvesting, and in the process, transforming wild rice into the modern varieties we're familiar with today. And farmers in sub-Saharan Africa domesticated wild millets, breeding for larger seeds, drought resistance, and faster growth cycles, into modern millets well suited for growing in a variety of climatic conditions. The cultivation of wild plants and their transformation into domesticated crops was accompanied by a similar process with animals, as animals like sheep, goat, cattle, pigs, and chicken, among others, were gradually tamed and bred for their meat, milk, wool, and labor, providing another source of food and resources and assisting in tasks like plowing fields. The profound social, economic, political, and cultural changes evoked by the agricultural revolution are impossible to overstate. Before the Neolithic Revolution, humans lived in small nomadic groups that moved with the seasons to follow animal herds and gather wild plants. The advent of agriculture changed this dynamic. As humans began to cultivate crops and domesticate animals, they no longer needed to move constantly in search of food. The ability to produce a reliable and stable food supply led to the establishment of permanent settlements with houses, storage facilities, and other structures. Over time, these settlements grew larger and more complex, eventually evolving into villages and then cities. One of the most crucial impacts of the Neolithic Revolution was the creation of surplus food production. Unlike hunter-gatherer societies, which were limited by the availability of wild resources and could only harvest the amount of food they could carry with them, agricultural societies could produce more food than was immediately needed, storing surpluses over time and trading with neighboring communities. However, contemporary research suggests that early farming communities actually suffered from a lower quality diet, narrowing the diversity of foods available and resulting in a decrease in the quality of human nutrition compared to foraging. But settlement also permitted the development of new foods and cooking techniques, including, for example, cheese making, bread making, and fermenting foods, and perhaps most importantly, brewing beer and making wine. Over time, technological innovations like the plow and irrigation, and the domestication of animals generated a much larger surplus of food, which supported larger populations and fueled a variety of social changes. The accumulation of surplus food and resources led to the emergence of social hierarchies as individuals and families who controlled more land and resources became wealthier and more powerful, creating distinct social classes. At the same time, surplus production permitted the specialization of labor and the rise of different occupations, including craftsmen, traders, and priests, further contributing to social stratification. As settlements grew larger, the need for organization and management became evident, and early forms of government emerged to regulate resources, maintain order, and provide protection. Leaders, who were often chosen for their ability to manage resources or lead in times of conflict, began to wield authority over others, leading to the establishment of ruling classes and centralized governance. The transition to settled agricultural life also led to the development of organized religion, with religious practices and rituals often centered around agricultural cycles, fertility, and the worship of deities associated with the earth and harvest. Temples and religious structures were built, becoming central places for community gatherings and spiritual activities, and priestly classes emerged, holding significant influence over social and political matters. The Neolithic Revolution spurred numerous technological advancements. As humans settled into agricultural life, they developed new tools and techniques to improve farming and daily life. The invention of the plow made it easier to till the soil and prepare fields for planting, and irrigation systems brought water to crops, increasing agricultural productivity and enabling farming in arid regions. The creation of pottery allowed for the storage and transportation of surplus food and water, and provided containers for cooking and preserving food. And the building of permanent structures, including houses, granaries, and temples, led to the advancement of construction techniques and materials. Finally, the Neolithic Revolution transformed the landscape. Large areas of forests were cleared to make way for fields and pastures. This deforestation led to habitat loss and changes in local ecosystems. Intensive farming practices, such as continuous cropping and irrigation, led to soil depletion and erosion without proper management. Soils lost their fertility, reducing agricultural productivity. The focus on cultivating specific crops and domesticating certain animals led to a reduction in biodiversity, and wild plant and animal species that were not useful to humans were often displaced or driven to extinction. And the construction of irrigation systems and the diversion of rivers for agricultural use altered natural waterways, impacting aquatic ecosystems and water availability. The Neolithic Revolution led to the rise of early civilizations like those in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus River Valley. In Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the fertile soil of the river valleys, enriched by annual flooding, provided ideal conditions for agriculture. Surplus food production led to population growth and the establishment of city-states like Uruk, and Babylon, all part of the broader Sumer. The Sumerians' sophisticated irrigation systems permitted them to control the flow of river water, allowing year-round cultivation of crops like barley, wheat, flax, and dates. Those agricultural surpluses and the ability to store them permitted the development of writing and complex city-states governed by legal codes. It also facilitated trade and economic stability and supported the development of a class of non-farming specialists who contributed to advancement in writing, law, and architecture. In ancient Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile River provided fertile soil and water for irrigation, allowing for the cultivation of crops including wheat, barley, flax, and papyrus. The Egyptian Empire, which rose around 3100 BCE, was the dominant power of the region for nearly 3,000 years. Food surpluses allowed for the growth of a complex society with a centralized government, exemplified by the construction of monumental architecture like the pyramids. Agricultural surpluses supported a bureaucracy that organized large-scale construction projects and maintained social order, and the development of complex religious practices and festivals that closely tied to the agricultural calendar and the cycle of the Nile. And finally, in the Indus Valley of modern-day Pakistan and India, the region's climate and seasonal flooding provided suitable conditions for agriculture. Indus Valley farmers developed sophisticated irrigation and drainage systems, permitting the cultivation of wheat, barley, peas, lentils, and cotton, among other crops. Surplus food production supported large urban centers like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, characterized by advanced urban planning and sanitation systems, architecture, and writing. The agricultural economy enabled trade with neighboring regions, enhancing cultural and economic exchange, and supported a variety of occupations, leading to social differentiation and the development of craft and industries. Over time, the early technologies employed by these agrarian civilizations spread and were improved upon, leading to dramatic improvements in crop yield and nutrition. Early canals and ditches used to irrigate fields were improved. In Persia, qanats were used to transport water via underground channels from aquifers to fields, preventing evaporation. In modern times, sprinkler systems and drip irrigation reduced water waste and evaporation, improving the efficiency of water distribution. Similarly, early stone hand plows used to break the soil were replaced by animal-drawn plows, improving efficiency. The introduction of iron plows in the Iron Age allowed for deeper plowing and more durable tools. In the Middle Ages, the moldboard plow turned soil more efficiently still, creating furrows for planting. And in the modern age, modern tractors and plowing machinery drastically reduced the time and labor required to prepare fields. Crop rotation patterns were similarly improved. Early methods centered on the abandonment and migration away from exhausted fields. Over time, the two-field system focused on planting in one field while the other was left fallow. In the Middle Ages, three-field rotation permitted the growth of one field of winter crops like winter wheat, rye, barley, or oats, a second dedicated to spring crops like maize or vegetables, and a third was permitted to lie fallow. Later, the introduction of nitrogen-fixing legumes were used to replenish the soil. And it's not just in these areas, but also in areas like breeding and genetics, farm management, and countless others that we see development over time. Indeed, the combination of advances in the 18th and 19th centuries contributed to what would be known as a second agricultural revolution, with its impacts almost as profound as those of the first. Indeed, the advances of the Second Agricultural Revolution would lead to dramatic increases in food production, supporting a rapidly growing world population and setting the stage for the Industrial Revolution. The Second Agricultural Revolution was characterized by several distinct features. Perhaps the most significant of these was the enclosure movement. Enclosure was a process that originated in England and centered on the consolidation of small landholdings and commons into larger enclosed farms owned by individual landowners. This process was highly contested and had dramatic social, cultural, economic, and political consequences. It displaced millions of small farmers and commoners who relied on common land for grazing animals and collecting firewood, forcing them to become laborers on newly enclosed farms or migrate to cities in search of work. Enclosure sparked social unrest and protest as people resisted the loss of traditional rights and ways of life. But it also sparked a dramatic increase in agricultural productivity in the English countryside, arguably contributing to Britain's growth as a global superpower. But it wasn't just enclosure. The Second Agricultural Revolution also involved improvements in agricultural technologies. The traditional two- and three-field system was replaced by more sophisticated crop rotation methods, such as the four-field system developed by Charles Townshend. This system included rotating different crops like wheat, barley, turnips, and clover, improving soil fertility and reducing fallow periods, thereby increasing overall crop yields and enabling the continuous use of agricultural land. Selective breeding, championed by pioneers like Robert Bakewell, involved choosing the best animals for breeding to enhance desirable traits like size, strength, and productivity, leading to the development of improved livestock breeds that would produce more milk, meat, wool, and labor, contributing to greater agricultural productivity. The introduction of machinery such as Jethro Tull's seed drill and Andrew Mielke's threshing machine revolutionized farming practices by reducing manual labor and increasing efficiency. Mechanization increased the speed and scale of planting, harvesting, and processing of crops. It reduced labor costs and allowed for larger-scale farming operations. New crop management techniques, including the use of fertilizers and soil amendments, improved crop healths and yields. Lime and marl were used to counteract soil acidity, and later chemical fertilizers were developed to enhance soil fertility, increase crop yields, and support the growth of more diverse and productive crops. More broadly, the application of scientific principles to farming practices known as agronomy emerged, as scientists and farmers began to study soil chemistry, plant biology, and animal husbandry systematically, ultimately leading to further technological advances. And the development of better roads, canals, and later railways facilitated the efficient transportation of agricultural products to market, integrating regional markets and supporting economic development and urban growth. Through all of this, the Second Agricultural Revolution also had significant social and environmental impacts. It fueled a growing population as more reliable food supplies led to improved health, decreased mortality rates, and reduced the likelihood of famine. It also permitted urbanization as the displacement of small farmers due to the enclosure movement and the increased efficiency of agricultural practices led many rural workers to seek employment in urban areas, fueling the growth of cities and the Industrial Revolution, as the agricultural surpluses allowed for the specialization of labor and the development of new industries, providing the necessary capital and labor force for the burgeoning industrial economy. At the same time, the consolidation of land into larger farms led to changes in land ownership patterns, with wealthier landowners gaining control over vast tracts of land. The shift also contributed to increased social stratification in rural areas. And while the Second Revolution began in Britain, its impact would eventually spread throughout all of Europe and eventually worldwide. The Green Revolution, sometimes called the Third Agricultural Revolution, refers to a period from the 1940s to the late 1960s when significant advancements in agricultural technology and practices dramatically increased food production worldwide. The initiative aimed to alleviate hunger and boost food security in developing countries through the introduction of high-yielding crop varieties, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and modern farming techniques, but it also carried a number of controversial legacies that continue to affect the world today. The basic idea of the Green Revolution was to apply modern technology to improve crop yields in the countries of the Global South. The initiative was very much a product of the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Indeed, as William Goud, the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, said in a speech in March 1968, these and other developments in the field of agriculture contain the makings of a new revolution. It is not a violent red revolution like that of the Soviets, nor is it a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. I call it a green revolution. This Cold War context shaped the Green Revolution to its core, as the United States and other Western powers poured hundreds of millions of dollars into agricultural research to fund the development of new high-yielding varieties of staple crops like wheat, rice, and maize. Many of these new varieties were also more resistant to diseases, pests, and environmental stresses, leading to higher productivity and more reliable harvests. But they also required more extensive use of fertilizers, pesticides, and other chemical inputs. And they required regular access to water to perform well, necessitating investment in large-scale irrigation projects to provide a reliable water supply to support intensive farming. In some areas, the introduction of tractors, combine harvesters, and other machinery reduced the labor required for planting, tending, and harvesting of crops, enhancing efficiency and productivity in agricultural operations and allowing for cultivation of larger areas. And the introduction of new seed varieties was accompanied by the promotion of improved farming practices and techniques, including crop rotation, soil management, and pest control methods intended to maximize yields. The Green Revolution had a dramatic impact where it was introduced. It significantly boosted grain yields and food production, particularly in developing countries like India, Mexico, and the Philippines. For example, India's wheat production doubled between 1965 and 1972, transforming the country from a food deficit nation to a food exporter. Improved crop yields helped reduce hunger and malnutrition in many parts of the world, as the increased food supply contributed to better food security and improved public health. Indeed, the success of the Green Revolution in Asia and Latin America played a crucial role in preventing famines and ensuring a stable food supply. And increased agricultural productivity stimulated economic growth, particularly in rural areas. Farmers' incomes rose, leading to improved living standards and the development of rural infrastructure, and the agricultural surplus generated by the Green Revolution sometimes enabled investment in rural education, healthcare, and infrastructure. But despite its positives, the Green Revolution also had negative impacts. While it prevented famine in many regions of the world, chronic hunger and poverty remained a problem, particularly among the rural poor displaced by the growing rural inequality fueled by the Green Revolution. Because increased yields depended on the ability of farmers to purchase expensive chemical inputs, it disproportionately benefited early adopters. The Green Revolution thus tended to increase rather than reduce inequality in regions where it was adopted. In many areas, gender inequality also increased as activities performed by men tended to benefit from the new technologies, reinforcing their position in the household and undermining the positionality of women. The intensive use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides also tended to result in higher levels of soil degradation, water pollution, and loss of biodiversity, as farmers abandoned traditional cultivars in favor of new plant varieties grown as monocultures. Over-reliance on irrigation also contributed to water scarcity and salinization of soils, and exposure to pesticides raised many health concerns for farm workers and consumers. And finally, the Green Revolution contributed to a greater dependency on high-input agriculture, with farmers relying heavily on synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation. This dependency made farming more expensive, increasing production costs and making farmers more vulnerable to price fluctuations and supply chain disruptions. For many farmers, the rising cost of the technology led to ever-increasing levels of indebtedness. The current debate over genetically modified organisms and patented seed varieties raise similar questions, albeit in an evolving context. But that's a topic for another day. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.